Hey everybody, Google has introduced a new pricing plan for Apigee. This new plan is called Pay As You Go. As the name implies, this is a flexible plan where you only pay for what you use. In this video, I'm going to discuss how this plan works, and I will take you through the steps of provisioning a new Pay As You Go Apigee environment from scratch. My name is Miguel Mendoza, and I hope you're going to learn something new today. So what exactly is Pay As You Go, and when and why we use it versus going with a subscription plan? Well, I'm going to give you some of my takes on this, and the rest is up to you to decide. So first of all, if you work at a very large company that already has established APIs and you already have a predictable amount of API traffic that you see month to month or year to year, and you could do a calculations and see how much it would cost you to go with Pay As You Go versus going with one of these subscriptions. However, if you're just starting out small, but you still need all the power and capabilities of the full Apigee API platform, Pay As You Go is not a bad choice. You can start small with Pay As You Go, get the full feature set of capabilities and grow. And as you're growing, maybe eventually switch to a subscription plan or stay Pay As You Go as long as you feel is economically sensible. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, I'm not gonna go yet through exactly how the pricing model works. We'll get to that once we start provisioning the Apigee Pay As You Go environment, and I will explain some of these new concepts that are like API gateway nodes that have been introduced in this new Pay As You Go model. So what do we need to get started with Pay As You Go? All you need is really just a GCP project and a credit card. That's basically it. You don't have to, well, when I say a credit card, it's a billing account. You have to have your project configured with a billing account. How that billing account is configured, it depends on your organization. But you don't have to sign a contract or anything. You literally just go to your GCP project, go through the setup wizard, and maybe after an hour or so, you have a fully running Apigee instance that's ready to go. So let's go ahead and do that. As I promised, we're going to be doing this from scratch. So let's go to the Cloud Console and create a new project. All right, so we're in the Cloud Console. Let's do a new project. I'm just gonna name this my Apigee project. And let's put my name in there just to make it unique. All right, so now let's select the billing account and create the project. It will take a few seconds for the project to be created. Once the creation is done, we'll switch to that project. So it looks like it's complete. Let's now select the project. Now that I'm in this project, let's go ahead and look for Apigee X. All right, so we have the Apigee X product. We'll select that. Now it takes us to this initial welcome page because we don't really have Apigee set up on this project. So let's go ahead and click on Setup Apigee. And immediately it looks like there's an error. It's saying I don't have permissions to access this project, even though I am the owner of the project. I think it's just saying that I need certain Apigee specific permissions to set up the wizard. So, to use the setup wizard. So let's go back to the Cloud Console and give myself those permissions. We can take a look in the documentation as well, and we'll see that what it's saying is that you need to be an organization admin. So let's go ahead and do that. So on the Cloud Console, we'll go to IAM, and I'm going to give myself the necessary permissions. So I'm going to make myself an Apigee org admin. So now I have the organization admin, and I think that should be enough. So let's save that. And we will go back to the wizard. And let's refresh this page, and hopefully the error will go away. Great, so the error went away. Now it's giving us choices. Choose a pricing plan. So before pay-as-you-go, all we had was evaluation and Apigee subscription. Now this is new right here, use pay-as-you-go. So let's go ahead and click here. All right, so first it's saying, hey, you don't have the necessary APIs enabled. So for the wizard to work, and in general for Apigee to be able to be set up on this project, there are certain APIs that need to be enabled. So that's what this step is doing. So let's go ahead and click on edit, and you can see it's telling you specifically what APIs are going to be enabled. So you have the Apigee API, KMS APIs, Compute Engine, and Service Networking. So let's go ahead and enable the APIs. This will take maybe a minute or so. All right, so the APIs have been enabled. Let's go on to the next step. We'll go to step number 2. Step number 2 is the creation of the Apigee organization. And what this does behind the scenes, it really just spins up the Apigee control plane. So once we have an Apigee organization created, we can actually go to the control plane and play around and create some stuff like proxies. Even though we cannot deploy them at that time, we can still create those things. So anything that does not require the runtime but only needs a control plane, you'll be able to do after the organization has been created. So in order to create an organization, first it wants us to choose an analytics region. This is basically the region where the analytics data is going to be saved. In this case, let's just pick US Central 1, and also a database encryption key. So all the data that's stored through the control plane, it's encrypted at rest. So this is basically what this encryption key is going to be used for. So let's pick a region for this. So we'll do Central as well, US Central. And let's go ahead and create a new keyring and a new key for this purpose. All right, so we're gonna create a new keyring. I'm just gonna call this Apigee DB keyring. It's going to be in US Central, and the key is going to be just Apigee DB key. Continue. So the key and the keyring and the key have not been created yet. This is just telling you what it's going to do. So now let's go ahead and create. Now you can see that it's telling us, hey, there is this service account in here, or this identity that needs access to this key. What is this exactly? Well, this is the service account, or a service account that gets created. It doesn't get created in your project, it's in a separate project, but this service account needs access to the key and the keyring that are in your project. And what this step is doing is saying, I'm just going to allow access so that this service account can access that information. And once again, this is the identity of Apigee within your, doesn't exist within your project, but it's scoped to your organization. All right, so we have granted access. Now let's go ahead and create the Apigee organization. And again, this will take maybe around 5 minutes or so. So just leave it there and wait. And once it's complete, we'll move on to the next step. All right, so the organization has been created. Now, before we move on to the next step, networking, let's go ahead and take a look at the control plane that I was telling you about earlier. So right now it should be up and working. So if we go to a new tab and just go to apigee.google.com, you can see now that for this new organization that I created, my Apigee Pagee demo, there's already a control plane that's up and running, and we can actually go through different parts of the control plane and work with it, even though we don't have an actual runtime instance yet. All right, so let's go back to the wizard now. All right, so let's do networking. Let's click on the edit button, and right away it asks us to select an authorized network. What is this? This is basically telling us what VPC or virtual private cloud do we want to use for this Apigee organization. In this project, I have not created any VPCs yet. Remember, this is an empty project that I created from scratch. So let's go back to the Cloud Console and create a VPC as well as a subnet. So back in here, I'm just going to search for VPC. And we'll create a new VPC network. I'm just going to call this Apigee Net. All right, and let's create a subnet as well at the same time. I'm going to call this Apigee Subnet. I'm going to pick also the same region, US Central. And in here, I had to specify a CIDR range. This is up to you. If you're working on a large organization that it already has a lot of subnets and stuff, you want to make sure that the CIDR range does not conflict with existing CIDRs. And I think it won't let you actually create it if there's a conflict. But since this is a fresh configuration, I'm just going to pick the same one as the example. All right, so we have the CIDR range. Next, this is critical. We need to make sure that we have private Google access set to on this subnet. So let's select that, and we'll select all the default rules for that it recommends for the firewall. Great. And I'm just gonna keep this as a regional routing mode for now. So let's go ahead and create this. All right, so we have our new VPC network with a subnet already created in the US Central region. So we should be able to go now to the wizard, and the wizard will detect that this is there and give us a choice to select it. Actually, it's still creating, so let's give it a second or so. All right, it is there now. Let's jump into the wizard and refresh here. Now the wizard says, hey, you have a new VPC network created. Let's select that. Now the wizard is asking us to reserve peering ranges. And it gives us two choices. First is automatically allocate the peering ranges, or select existing ranges that I have already created within this VPC network. For now, I'm just going to choose automatically allocate IP range. And again, if you're at a organization that's very strict about what ranges need to be used for, specifically for what, in order to avoid conflicts, you don't want to use this. You want to pre-create these ranges in the Cloud Console and then select them here. So what are these ranges used for? Basically, there's two ranges that will be created by the wizard. One range is a /22, and the other range is a /28. So essentially, what these ranges are used for, once your VPC in this project pairs with service networking, which is what Apigee uses, these ranges will be used on the Apigee tenant project, which is you don't have access to create subnets, and then those subnets will be exported as routes back to your project through the peering connection. And you can read more on the documentation about this. So for now, let's just go ahead and allocate, let it automatically allocate the ranges. All right, so this will take a little bit of time because it's doing two steps. First is creating the ranges, and then it's going to create a peering connection with service networking. All right, so the networking step is complete. Let's go ahead and jump quickly to the Cloud Console to see what actually happened over there. So if we jump into VPC network peering, we can see that a new peering connection has been created between your VPC network and service networking. Now, service networking is a way of accessing managed services in Google using private RFC 1918 IPs. The way it works, you can read more about it in the documentation, but essentially there's a third project that gets created that's called the Service Networking Host, and this project contains a shared VPC. So whenever a new managed service gets spun up in your GCP organization, that will be in a new tenant project, which will be using the shared VPC from here. Hopefully that makes sense. Like I said, you can read more about it in the GCP documentation. So let's go back and actually one more thing. So if we go back to the VPC that we created, we should be able to see that there is these two new ranges that got created. These were created by the wizard itself, and it picked them automatically, so we didn't specify them. And you can see we had the /22 and the /28. One of them is used for spinning up a subnet to create a Kubernetes cluster, which we'll see on later on. That all happens behind the scenes. And the other one is used by basically Apigee support in case they need to do some troubleshooting, so they don't have to mess up with the runtime CIDR range. All right, so let's go back to the wizard. So what is the runtime? The runtime is nothing more than the Apigee component that receives the API traffic and handles it. That's basically it. Behind the scenes, it's actually a Kubernetes cluster that's running in another project that you don't have access to. And that Kubernetes cluster has installed all the Apigee components necessary to route and process API traffic. So let's go ahead and set it up. So if I click on edit, first thing it is asking us is to select a region. So we need to choose a region where this Kubernetes cluster with all the components is going to be spun up. So for now, I'm just going to pick the same region I've been picking, which is US Central. Next is asking us to select an IP range. You may be thinking, wait, is this? Didn't we just do that on the previous networking step? How is this different? It's not. It really all it's saying is that, hey, from those ranges that you selected, please tell us which /22 do you want to use to spin up this runtime. That's all this means. So why is it asking us to select one? Well, you may have more than one /22 associated with that peering connection. So if you want to be specific, you tell it which one you want, or you can just tell it, hey, pick the first /22 that's available and go with that. So we only have one in our case, so automatic is just fine. Next, it wants us to select a disk encryption key. So the runtime itself, right? Those are VMs that are that have a Kubernetes cluster running on them, and those have disks themselves. So right. So when those VMs spin up, you want to make sure that the data in there is secure. So this is basically what this encryption key is used for. So let's create a new keyring and a new encryption key for that. So let's go ahead and create one. So this is going to be Apigee disk keyring, and it's on US Central. Continue. Now let's do the name for the key, Apigee disk key. Continue. And let's go ahead and create it. And just like before, we have to allow access to the Apigee identity. The Apigee service account needs access to this keyring and the key in order to be able to utilize them. So let's go ahead and grant it access. And let's go ahead and click here to create the runtime. Now this step is going to take some time, right? So it's not, remember, behind the scenes, there's another project that's created, and in that project, a new network is created with a new subnet, and a set of VMs, virtual machines, get created, and a Kubernetes cluster gets created with all the Apigee components in there. So it takes some time to spin that up. It's usually around 20, maybe 25 minutes usually. So let's just give it some time, and we'll come back to it once it's done. All right, so the runtime has been created, and you can see here that it tells us what is the internal IP of this runtime. And if you recall, this IP came from that /22 range that we reserved earlier during the networking step. So let's go ahead and take a look in the Apigee control plane to see what actually happened. What happened when we spun up this runtime. So if we go back to the Apigee control plane and click on API admin, and we click on instances, we can see that there is a new instance. And yes, this is the IP address for this instance, and there's also a service attachment. I'm not gonna go over how to use this service attachment in this video, but suffice to say that these are two different ways of accessing the Apigee runtime instance. You can call directly to the ingress IP address, or you can use a service attachment to basically call into the Apigee ingress from a VPC maybe in a different project. So if we click on the instance itself, we can see some more details about it, and you can see here IP range. So it's listing those two ranges that we reserved earlier, and we had the /22 and the /28. Remember, the /22 is for the actual API traffic. And if we go into the Cloud Console, we're going to see now that the instance has been created, and go to the network peering connection. So let's open up the peering connection between ApigeeNet and service networking. And in here, we can see now that there's a new route that has been imported through this peering connection. And this happens to be the decider for the runtime for Apigee, which means that within this project, within this VPC, I should be able to reach the Apigee ingress because we have a route to it, because the route was imported now. All right, so hopefully that clears up what the runtime is. And now let's go back to the wizard. All right, now the runtime is ready. Let's move on to the next step. In this step, we're going to be configuring an environment group as well as an environment that's going to be attached to this runtime instance that we stood up. So what is an environment group? The way that I like to think about it is that an environment group is logically equivalent to a virtual host in other products such as Envoy and Nginx. And using the concept of virtual host, you're able to attach one or more host names to a single IP address or a single listener. So that's what it says in Apigee. When you create an environment group, you give it a name and you give it a host name. So in this case, I'm going to give a host name that I already have access to. So this is going to be api-dem.miguelmendoza-demo-autostrat.com. And it's important that when you set this up, that you or somebody in your organization has access to the DNS records to set this up, because later you're going to need to add a DNS A record for this hostname, and we'll see that later on once I do it. Next, let's do the environment itself. So an environment group can contain one or more environments. In this case, we're creating a single environment within the dev environment group, and that's totally fine. As your organization grows, you can keep adding more environments. The more proxies you have in your organization, the more environments you need. Or if you want to have certain way of structuring your proxies in your organization, where maybe you have different teams owning different environments, you could also do that. Create separate environments for different teams and put those environments under the same group or under different groups. It all depends on how you want to organize this, depending on your business model. So far, all the steps that we've gone through are essentially the same, regardless of whether you're using the pay-as-you-go payment model or the subscription model or even the evaluation license. Now is where things are a little bit different with the pay-as-you-go model. In this model, for every environment, you have to specify a minimum and maximum number of gateway nodes. So what exactly are these gateway nodes? Remember, the spirit of pay-as-you-go is that you pay for what you use. So what are you using exactly? Well, behind the scenes, there's another project where in that project, there's a network created, and in that network, there are VMs created. And in those VMs, we have a Kubernetes cluster, and that cluster has Kubernetes pods. So there's a lot of compute resources as well as networking resources that are being consumed. But we don't want you to go to that level of detail. We're saying, let's abstract that and create this concept of a gateway node, where we're saying that each environment requires a minimum of 2 gateway nodes, and each gateway node allows you to handle a certain amount of API traffic. As of right now, as of release, basically each gateway node allows you to handle about 300 transactions per second under ideal conditions. So in this case, the environment has a minimum of 2 gateway nodes, so it has a cumulative capacity of 600 transactions per second. What happens if you go over 600 transactions per second? Well, the system will auto-scale and keep adding more gateway nodes based on how much traffic is being received. And you can cap that by putting a limit on how many nodes you wanted to ever allow this environment to scale up to, if you want to make sure that you won't ever exceed that amount. So how do you pay for these gateway nodes or for the usage of the gateway nodes? Well, each gateway node has a price per hour. So for every hour that you use one gateway node, you pay a certain amount. And in this case, we have 2 gateway nodes, so we'll pay for 2 gateway nodes per hour. Basically, that will be the charge plus whatever other networking charges associated. You can look that up in the documentation. So in the pay-as-you-go model, it's not just gateway nodes. You also may need to pay for ingress and egress charges out of the VPC. Great. So let's go ahead and create this environment and environment group and attach it to the runtime instance. So this will take some time. So let's just give it a little time and we'll wait. Great. So the environment and the environment group have been created and it has been attached to the runtime instance. Let's see what actually happened behind the scenes. So if we go back to the Apigee control plane and take a look at environments and overview, we should be able to see now that there's a new environment created called default dev, and it has an aggregate of 2 gateway nodes. there should also be a new environment group with the hostname that I specified. Finally, if we go to the instances, we see now that the default -dev environment is attached to the runtime instance. The wizard did all of this work for us. Now, we didn't have to use a wizard for that. We could have just come to the Apigee UI and do all those steps manually. It's just nice that if you're doing this for the first time, the wizard creates it for you. But if you have a more complex set of environments and environment groups that you want to create, you can just go ahead and do it manually in the Apigee control plane UI. All right, let's do the final step. Here, we have to decide how we're going to allow API clients to access the runtime instance that we created earlier. The wizard gives us two choices: no internet access and enable internet access. If we choose no internet access, nothing really happens because that's already the current state. The runtime instance has an IP address that is only reachable from within our VPC network. So that's already the case and nothing will happen. Now, the most common case is that customers want to enable internet access so that API clients can talk to their APIs over the public internet. Now, in order to make that happen, the wizard will create a few resources in your GCP project in order to allow network traffic to flow from the internet to the Apigee runtime instance. Let's quickly go over what are these resources that are going to be created. First, we have a Google Cloud Global HTTPS load balancer. And second, we have a Compute Engine instance group. The way it's going to work is that the load balancer will have a backend that's pointed to the instance group, and the instance group will forward traffic to the Apigee runtime instance. So you may ask, why is this instance group needed at all? The reason is because, remember, this Apigee runtime instance is not really running in your project. This is running on another project and is being accessed through VPC peering. The global load balancer is not able to transit all the way through the peering and go directly to the runtime instance. Only VMs within the VPC are able to reach the runtime instance. Because of this, we have to spin up this instance group, which is basically a network bridge. And it's really not doing anything other than literally just having IP tables rules to do basically packet forwarding of anything that comes on port 443, forwarding it to this IP address. So we have to tell the wizard what subnet to use for spinning up this instance group. So let's go ahead and do that and select the subnet that I created very early on in the video. Also, we have to tell the wizard what is the certificate that we want to use for the global load balancer. If you have your own certificate, you can bring it right now and upload it right here. Or if you leave this empty, what's going to happen is that the wizard will create a Google managed certificate and will associate that managed certificate with the load balancer. I don't have a certificate, so I'm just going to leave it empty. So let's go ahead and click access and let's see what happens. While the wizard is running, we can actually go ahead and inspect all these resources that are being created behind the scenes. I'm going to open a new tab and go to the Cloud Console. So first, let's take a look at the instance group. So we see that a new instance group has been created and there are 3 instances in it. And we can take a look and everything appears to be healthy. This might not be the case for you. If you see that there's any errors, be sure to inspect the errors tab and address any issues that may come up. Some typical issues that you may see are there may be organization policies that prevent the VMs in this instance group from coming up, or there may be security restrictions also as well that prevent the VMs from coming up. So just always make sure to check the errors, and once the instance group is in a green state, that means the instance group is good to go. Next, let's take a look at the load balancer. So we'll go to the load balancer page, and we can see that there's already a new load balancer created. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so the load balancer has one backend, which is pointing to the instance group, and has a frontend with an IP address, and also has a SSL certificate. So let's take a look at the SSL certificate. We can see that this is a Google managed SSL certificate, but it's in provisioning state. Now the certificate is going to stay in provisioning state unless we configure this domain name to point to the IP address of the load balancer, which means that we need to have access to the DNS zone for this domain name to be able to add an A record. So let's go ahead and do that. For my case, I have a cloud DNS zone in a different project that I use for managing this domain, so I can add a new A record for API dev. So let me go on a new tab and go to the console, and in here we'll switch to my project where I manage the DNS zone, and in here we'll go to cloud DNS, and in this DNS zone we're going to add a new A record. So it is going to be API-dev. It's an A record, and the IP address is the IP address of the load balancer itself. So let's grab that. This is the IP address. Let's put it in, create, and now we should be all good to go. It's not immediate. It takes some time for the DNS record to propagate, and also for the processes in GCP to detect that the new DNS record is there, and it usually takes around 10 more minutes before it goes from provisioning state to the active state. Let's jump back into the wizard and see if it's complete. All right, so according to the wizard, everything is complete. So let's go ahead and click continue. Yay, congratulations. According to the wizard, everything is ready and good to go. But it gives us a few more steps, or recommended steps. One is to configure a DNS A record, which we already did. And two is to test our API runtime by actually deploying a proxy and making a call to it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's click on deploy and see what happens. So the wizard has successfully deployed an API proxy into Apigee, and it gives us a couple of commands that we can use to test this new API proxy that was deployed. There's two flavors that it gives us. First one is if you have not set up DNS, you can use this command, or if you already have set up DNS like I have, you can use this other command to test it out. So what actually happened behind the scenes? So if we go into the Apigee UI or the control plane, we can go ahead and take a look at the API proxies that were deployed, and we can see that there is a new API proxy called helloworld, and this helloworld API proxy is deployed to the default dev environment. So we should be able to test this now. But before we go ahead and test it, let's go back to the load balancer and check if the certificate has provisioned successfully. So we go back in here and let's refresh this page, and let's click on the certificate again, and looks like it's active already. So technically everything should be good to go. So let's go ahead and actually do the test. So the test wants us to run this curl command to invoke the API. We don't really need to use curl. This is just an HTTP GET. So technically we can just grab this URL, put it in a new tab and paste it, and it should be the same thing. So let me copy this. We'll open a new tab. All right, let's paste it and remove curl from the beginning. And here we go. And great, we got a response, hello world. This is actually the Apigee runtime instance handling the traffic and replying with hello world. This is awesome. Well, folks, this is it. We went from scratch to now having a fully working Apigee X system. And we did this using the setup wizard with the pay-as-you-go model. If this was useful to you, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.